So now we'll move to the keynote speech, the first keynote speech, and my colleague Piroshka from LSE will introduce our first keynote speaker. Piroshka.
Good morning, everyone. I am Piroshka Nagy-Mohácsi. I work with Eric Berglov, whom you have already heard in LSE at the Institute for Global Affairs, and very closely now, I'm proud to say, with Nasser and his wonderful team on the migration area. It is my absolute distinct privilege to introduce you to the keynote speaker of today. He's coming from my neck of the wood, Central Europe, and has had an incredible career behind him. And he is now with us, with LSE at the Institute, so there is still, we look forward to a lot of new and big things to be done together with Professor Marek Belka. Professor Marek Belka is a unique band of academic research. He's published in the area of macro policy, monetary policy, inflation targeting. But maybe he's even better known for his political leadership, policy making in his home country, Poland, and regionally in Europe, as well as at the global level. Poland, as you know, is today one of the largest, most important European country. It was not the case until the fall of the Berlin Wall, until the changeover, political changeover that the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed to happen. Poland was a poor, underdeveloped, or misdeveloped country rather, and Professor Belka was a key architect of Poland's economic and political transformation from the beginning, from the 1990s. And that has really brought Poland from one of the laggard of Europe into one of the leaders of today's European Union. Poland is now, I just checked, among the 15 biggest economies in the world as a result partly of his efforts. His actually work in the transformation has been tested by the global financial crisis and how Poland reacted and managed that. Poland was the only country in Europe which did not suffer from a deep recession, and that was really to the credit of the very skillful transformation, which was politically and socially minded transformation that Professor Marek Belka has been part of. But he didn't stop in Poland. He has been a major architect of the European transformation. He played a founding role, for example, in the European Risk Stability Forum when the ECB was taking up further and Europe further systemic responsibilities. He was the director of the European department of the IMF at a critical juncture, just when the global financial crisis hit Europe, both emerging Europe from his originally and advanced Europe as well. And he was a leader in the thought process and innovative approach that the IMF finally took on to address the global financial crisis in the European context. Closer to home, we know him also, Eric and I, as the chairman of the Vienna Initiative, which is probably not that well known here, but has been critical in handling the European financial crisis in a cooperative, cross-border cooperative, multi-stakeholder fashion. He's popular, very much liked, and he is bringing a very unique aspect today to the discussion. The perspective of Europe and European politics and how it reflects, how it has reflected Europe when the Syrian refugee crisis had started, and how Europe has transformed, and perhaps some insights of how a collaborative and politically minded but still ambitious plan can be put together to manage the refugee crisis. Professor Marek Belka, please take the floor.
Well, thank you for your kind words, but the real recommendation for me to talk to you here is that I am a friend of Eric Berkloff and Piros Kanoc. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Well, there is another reason why I agreed to come 43 years ago when I was a student. I took a rather adventurous trip to this region with a friend of mine. You can imagine how impossible and difficult it was for two young people from behind the Iron Curtain. And on this trip I visited also Beirut, and the only thing really I remember from Beirut of 1974 was the campus of this university, where I was staying at a youth hostel in summer months. So when I got the invitation, I couldn't resist. So here I am. I'm not going to talk about Poland, about the region of Central and Eastern Europe, but I'll try to offer you some remarks on how Europe and the European polity, the European electorates, the European societies look at refugee crisis, which is now one of the constituting factors of European political landscape. Of course, people were attracted to Europe many years or many centuries ago, many years ago. In the after-war period, people drew to Europe because it was attractive from economic point of view, from social point of view, but also political developments prompted people to come to Europe from the collapsed colonial empires of France or Britain. So people from other parts of the world are not unusual for Europeans. They have always been there, and it looked for decades that the whole process was mutually advantageous or smoothly mutually advantageous. Europe needed people because of its demographics. The people needed Europe to better their livelihoods, to come back to where their homes or their perceived homes were, like the Pieds Noirs from Northern Africa. So what really happened recently that made the refugee crisis so different, so devastating politically and socially? One of my colleagues, a very interesting political analyst from Bulgaria, Ivan Krastev, you may have heard about him, he formulated something like a thesis, something like this, that the recent refugee crisis for Europe is similar in its impact to the 9/11 attack on World Trade Center in America. It changed politics. It changed the mood. Let's think about how it changed, how it could have changed, and what is the reaction of Europe to this? Well, first, what made this last wave of immigration different from others? I think there are many reasons, but let me mention three. Well, first, it's numbers. The numbers were bigger than before, than for many decades. Well, let's just realize that almost 2 million people came to Germany in 2 years, 2015 and 16. Germany is the biggest country and the biggest destination for refugees. But all in all, the whole Europe acquired or welcomed millions of refugees in the last 2-3 years. Well, why? Of course, we know it's the developments in Syria, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, many other developments in those regions of the world. Second, and this is something that you probably, it's obvious, it's a platitude, but let me mention it. It's the fear from terrorism. For the first time in my lifetime, as far as I remember, immigration was associated in a popular way with terrorism. Well, the successes, infamous successes of ISIS triggered this way of thinking and associating foreigners, refugees with terror. Even it was completely misleading. It was wrong. Most terrorists in France are the third generation people excluded from the French societies, and the same goes for the UK. But you don't need refugees to be afraid of them. In my country, there are no refugees. We have like 1 million Ukrainians, but they are seasonal workers and culturally so similar to us Poles that it's undistinguishable. And after 1 year, they speak Polish fluently. But still, the fear of refugees can be artificially produced by right-wing populists. Let me make a short statement on this. Populism has always been with us, but traditionally populists were the left-wing populists, okay? Anti-capitalist populists. So them, capitalists, us, workers, proletariat. Well, myself being probably left-leaning, but still mainstream economist, don't expect that I'm an enthusiast of left-wing populists. However, I'm sort of realistic enough to know that economists are now much more humble, much less imperialistic in their view of the world to recognize that there are grounds for left-wing populism. However, in the recent years, we observe another kind of populism emerging, which is the right-wing populism. The right-wing populism still has this us and them, capital labor dimension, but there is another, more vitriolic one, dimension, which is the aliens, us, people from our society, and them aliens. The right-wing populism is something that, well, smells on racism even. And it is on the rise, or at least it has been very much on the rise in Europe. Well, not only in Europe, of course. Look at the United States and the President Trump. He is certainly not a left-wing populist. But the right-wing? Yes. So the impact of the last wave of refugees, the numbers, the terrorist threat, created a prolific soil for right-wing populism. There is another factor, another reason of why the recent wave of refugees was different in the minds and in the perceptions of Europeans. It's the aftermath of the crisis. It's the aftermath of the crisis. it's not only the big financial crisis of 2008, but it's the long-run effect of globalization and technology on advanced economies. A loss of jobs is one of the consequences of those. And when you are uncertain about your economic future, when you are afraid of terrorist attacks, well, you can be exploited by certain politicians to become xenophobic, nativist, inward-looking, hostile to aliens. Well, so what did it change in the European political landscape? As I have already alluded to, right-wing populists entered the scene. Let's start chronologically as the situation evolved in the last well, a year and a half. Netherlands, you remember Kim Wilders and his anti-immigration stance. Marine Le Pen in France. But also, I think that Brexit was a result of this. Not so much the fear from Muslim immigration, but it's more about the Poles and the Romanians. So we have different layers, different dimensions of this threat, of this fear of immigration. Of course, what we are observing in Central Europe is another part of this drama. Countries here turn to illiberal democracy, turn xenophobic, even if they have no refugees, 0 refugees. My country is a very good example of this. We haven't agreed to any kind of sharing arrangement within the European Union, even if this would be of 0 effect on the Polish population. But you don't need refugees to be afraid of refugees. Well, even more so. About 15 years ago, Poland accepted about 70,000 of Chechens after the second Chechen war, so early Putin war, so to say. Well, the Chechens are known to be quite extreme Islamists, or at least there are some of them among them. There was no problem for us in the year 2001, 2002 to accept 70,000 of them. Maybe because they were enemies of Russia. If the enemies of our enemies, well, they must be friends. I mean, of course, it's a bitter irony on my side rather than a description of the situation. But there was no fear. And we don't have even one example of a terrorist incident coming from this side. Now we have no refugees at all, but 60% of the people, even those who don't vote for the current very inward-looking government, are against accepting refugees. So this is a clinical example of how you can manipulate people into xenophobia. Well, so is this a hopeless situation for Europe? Are we going to slide into right-wing populism? Are we going to desert our beloved notion that Europe is a community of values, human rights, openness. Don't treat it with cynicism. We really think we are open, helping. Let me joke a little bit. Much better than Americans, okay? Which is probably not true, but this is what Europeans like to think of themselves. Is this going to be lost? Well, I think that we have to be very pragmatic here, and there are already certain tendencies in the European politics, in the European social development that can stop this dangerous tendency. What is this? Well, if you believe in democracy, you have to look what the people think. I mean, the worst strategy would be to say, no, the people are stupid. Let's ignore right-wing populism or populism at large. Let them, come to their own mind. We have the high moral ground. There are certain political parties in Europe who act in the following way, and they lose dramatically. If we follow this route, we put at risk the whole European project. What is then the way out for democratic society? Well, you have to look seriously at what the people think, at what the people are afraid of, and try to mitigate those threats. Adapt some of these fears into your program. Tame them, well, domesticate them. And this is what is happening. Mark Rutte was probably the first leader of a West European country who sort of stole some of the ideas, some of the pronouncements, let's put it this way, of Kim Wilders. He told the people in the Netherlands, okay, I'll take care of this, but in a better way, in a more civilized way. Don't trust this lunatic, far-right lunatic. And many people believed him. He was re-elected. Well, we can go the Macron way or the Kurz way. Well, Kurz is probably prematurely. Kurz is the new election winner in Austria, who will probably become the youngest West European prime minister, 30 years old, 4 years after he assumed office of foreign minister. So he's a very experienced politician. So he has immediately been labeled as a far right, as a manifestation of the country going right to the wall of right-wingery. That's probably premature or not true. Macron, although he was part of the French establishment, he portrayed himself as a new phenomenon. What he says about, he abandoned the refugee issue as the main issue, but what he says is very definitive. I'm against illegal immigration, whatever it means. Kurz, the Austrian case, he chose immigration or refugees as the main election issue. But this does not mean that his position is very different from that of Macron. Well, of course, it's very difficult for a European to first unify their asylum policy, to invest in the protection of borders. Protection of borders is a tricky issue, because on the one hand, the people want it, and we have to do it. On the other, there will be opinions. We don't want Europe to be transformed into a fortress. So, how to balance these two issues? This is not entirely best news for Lebanon, but I think that the worst news for the Europeans would be to let the whole project of European integration to collapse because of radical change of mood of the population. I think that it's much better to make a small step back, put some order into the let's say, external border policy of Europe, spend more money where it is spent in a smartest way, and still retain Europe as a region where human rights, openness survives. Is this in the best interest of Beirut, American University in Beirut, the people of Syria? I don't know. It's up to you to decide. I don't have solutions. But this is how I perceive the European mood to develop. Thank you very much.